Painting white is always a challenge for everybody, even for the best painters. I tried to avoid this color for a long time, but today I will try to break my restrictions. In nature, pure white simply does not exist. Pure white color can be elusive because even the whitest objects in nature often have slight variations or hints of other colors due to factors like lighting conditions or impurities in materials. And that is the reference point for today's recording. So grab your paints, brushes, and let's start. I started by pre-highlighting both the Rider and the Weasel. My goal was to accent all muscle parts and leave a good amount of black in all recesses. After my pre-highlight dried, I prepared an oil wash. This serves two purposes. First, it will blend white and black due to its magic properties. And secondly, I need sienna in most of the recesses, especially between hairs, to create an interesting color tone. As we know, pure white does not exist in nature. It is always some interesting off-white color. After 30 minutes, I wiped away the excess wash with some cosmetic pads and left the mini to dry overnight before moving on to the next colors. After my oil wash fully dried, I picked bone white with the airbrush to apply the next highlight. In this step, I wanted to be more detailed. I didn't want to overpaint the colors applied in the previous stages, so I highlighted the whole mini, focusing mostly on all raised areas. In this stage, I dry brushed the whole miniature. You need to be sure that your brush is nearly completely dry, otherwise you will destroy your mini at some point. This method works on minis where fur is sculpted on most of the body, like in the case of this weasel. I was able to pull out all fur and flocks in this step. Take your time and do not rush. If you don't want to use the dry brush method, you can paint all the single hairs and flocks with your regular brush. But why? In this step, I will also dry brush the fur, but I will reduce the painted area. I want to have white only on the highest points of the mini, create an interesting colored tone on the Weasel. So again, I prepared my brush carefully on a paper towel and started to dry brush from the top of the mini until I was happy with the result. The only spot that I have not painted at this point was his tail, because I need a grip, and after I'm done with the mini, I can easily catch up on the tail. At this point, I need to prepare the base for the mini because the Weasel is in a running pose, and I do not want to wipe away the colors that I have applied earlier. So I applied basic colors to highlight them later on. I also wanted to create interesting brown-green tones on the leaves. I applied different green tones, and while the greens were still wet, I applied a brown-red tone in the middle that will wet blend with my greens and create an interesting random pattern. After my leaves dried, I mixed some pigment heavily diluted with water and applied it randomly all over the base to simulate dust and sand. Before I glued the mini to the base, I have applied some base colors, especially on those parts which are hard to reach with your brush. A part of the saddle I painted with this yellow-brown color, because ochre colors will break the monotony of green and white tones. Snakebite leather was applied to another part of the saddle because I did not want to keep all brown parts in one color. Snakebite leather will also go very well together with the rest of my browns, keeping the mini in the same color spectrum. I started to paint leaves on the Weasel. I used the same wet blending pattern on some leaves that I used on the base, creating a nice random pattern. I would advise that you try different settings, where on some leaves there is more brown than green, to keep your leaves interesting. Keeping the Weasel just white would be boring, so I painted some flesh elements with pastel salmon, which is a highly transparent color. I applied 2 coats and let this fully dry. After it dried, I diluted familiar pink with some medium and poured it onto all recesses to create a nice magenta shadow tone. If you apply too much, don't be afraid. Just go back and blend a bit of pastel salmon with magenta. If you need to highlight those places a bit more, you can go with highlighting the most raised areas with Vallejo salmon rose, heavily diluted with water. I started to highlight all green elements with some olive green tones. Because I want to simulate some nature, I do not need to be 100% accurate. Painting all edges like in a children's coloring book will look weird, so I focused on the most raised elements. If I overpainted some parts, I didn't particularly care. Army Painter Rainforest was my second highlight on all green elements. This time I reduced the painted area, used some dry brushing on a couple of elements, and started to paint some cool patterns on a few elements. To not get bored with the greens, I switched to some ochre highlights to accent my saddle and the elements around the saddle. If you want to highlight more, you can add some yellow to this and keep on highlighting like I did. Switching back to greens, I applied my last green highlight. I reduced my painted area and painted some additional cool patterns on all leaves. For a random pattern effect, you can use an old sponge or a used destroyed brush. The rider I painted with the same pattern as the weasel, but for my convenience I painted only the base colors. After that I glued the rider to the weasel. The fur, his leaves and browns I painted the exact same way as on the weasel, so to not keep you bored I will not show this a second time. Instead, I will start from the point where I started to be interesting. Baneblade brown is always a great way to highlight leather, so I kept highlighting the tiny details on the mouse. After my mouse was saddled, I could continue highlighting. So, first I highlighted his armor with the same ochre color that I used on the weasel, and later on I added Vallejo yellow, brighten it up. At the very last step, I highlighted all leaves on the mouse with these two greenish yellow colors. Those will create cool light reflections and great weathering effects. If you like this tutorial, don't forget to like the recording, comment down below and subscribe to the channel. And I will catch you the next time. Bye bye!